If I asked you what game speedrun is your favorite from the last few months, what would be your reply? Would you say you've watched the unraveling of Elden Ring any percent in all of its arbitrary code execution glory? Would you boast about the joy that Pokemon Legends Arceus has brought to the scene, regardless of how frustrating its out-of-bounds mechanics are? Or would you reveal the secrets of an underappreciated indie game that flew under the radar because it looked like a ripoff of Link to the Past? Clearly, there is only one choice here. Tunic is much more than what it looks like on the surface. The experience this game offers is nothing short of incredible for the casual player. What about the speedrunner though? Running through hordes of enemies while constantly on the edge of death, stunlocking bosses and turning difficult fights into child's play, and most importantly,
being weird.
All of this and more comes together in a magnificent display of skill that allows players to beat the game faster than it takes to make your dinner. Today, I want to show you all the beauty of Tunic's speedrunning scene. So this is how speedrunners beat Tunic in just 20 minutes. Now that we know what game we're actually talking about, let's define the second most important topic of the video, the game's category. Any percent, true ending, and New Game Plus would all be great to go over, but only one of these can be beaten in 20 minutes. The true ending record clocks in just under 10 minutes slower than any percent, so we're counting that one out. And while the New Game Plus category is substantially faster, there's a little less substance than the any percent run. Now I'm sure you've heard the word any percent thrown around countless times, but what does that mean for Tunic? Complete the game as quickly as possible through any means. Sounds simple enough, right? As with any open world game, the fastest way through the land may not be so obvious, so let's take a quick look at the game's route. The any percent speedrun has 4 major bosses. In the order they're defeated, they're the Scavenger boss, the Librarian, the Siege Machine, and finally the Heir. The Heir is also locked behind 3 keys that each boss protects. With these 3 keys, the player puts them into the slots at the sealed temple and triggers the final battle in the Forest Shore. Fairly simple, but the path to get there is perilous, with death lurking around every corner. So to navigate this, we'll unpack the run of one of the best speedrunners I know, a Whooper enthusiast who has taken top times in dozens of speed games. His 6-year tenure in the community has been an eventful one to say the least. TGH is a household name if you follow the modern speedrunning scene, and he recently set his sights on Tunic as a speedrun project. I'd say we have a pretty good framework for getting started, don't you think? We have the general boss path and the runner featured. All we need to know now is the how. These are all of the items and equipment required outside of the keys I mentioned earlier. We'll use these as a reference for TGH's progress during the run. Starting in the overworld, where every player's journey begins, TGH wants to reach the Frog's domain to obtain the most broken equipment in the game. Usually, getting to this point would require a sword and several other important parts of the inventory. However, that's slow, and we already have the ability to access the teleporter that brings us to the Forest Shore. Using one of our pieces of equipment dubbed the Holy Cross, TGH obtains a regular bomb and a fire bomb, allowing him to do some gardening and open the path to the first teleporter. Right before that though, TGH gets a chest with 2 bombs that are just hidden from view. The firebomb ends up being used right after opening the chest to defeat an enemy and trim some more hedges to avoid aggroing others in front of the teleporter. Going through the teleporter a couple times, it's here where we reach the ruined atoll for the first time. The ruined atoll has a few objectives that need completed in the run, but for now the main focus will be getting to the Frog's domain. After taking some time to chill at the shrine, TGH makes his way to the next area and dives into the cave filled with amphibians. Now normally to get our broken equipment we're here for, we need to trek through several rooms to reach the altar where our coveted magic orb lies. But luckily we have this little guy right here. If you throw a well-placed bomb down into the altar room, you can get the attention of the enemies. Even better, if you're in the right position, our frog friend will do this. So with a little bit of ingenuity, we now have this game's equivalent of a grappling hook, which allows the character to move quickly through areas using conspicuously placed points that can be grabbed with the magic orb. However, there is a slight problem we immediately face. TGH is stuck in the altar room, and escaping seems impossible. Death also looks to be inevitable as he runs through the enemies one more time. Like any good speedrunner though, he has a plan, one that'll make the rest of the Frogs domain look like a joke. So let's see what he does. There's a couple of things that happen here, so let's first look at the obvious. TGH didn't just take the shrine for a quick break, it served the purpose of being an anchor point for when the main character is defeated. Kinda like the bonfires in Dark Souls and many Souls-like games. Simple enough, but what about the other sequence right before coming back to the ruined atoll? The first death in Tunic is always greeted with the trip to the far shore to meet the heir for the first time, and then a revival to introduce how dying works in the game. Normally, this sequence can't be skipped, but TGH had a secret weapon already equipped. The last of the 2 bombs he attained earlier are used to abuse the game's death mechanics. So when he uses the bomb to do just that, he warps back to the shrine and ruined atoll. This mechanic will be used a lot throughout the short run, so be sure to get comfortable with it. Now that TGH has the magic orb, a lot more of the world opens up to him and he can quickly travel through most areas. However, the magic orb is just one piece of the puzzle, which is why he detours to the West Garden for his next pieces of equipment on our list. Back in the overworld, TGH opens a chest containing an item called an effigy. In a casual setting, this can be broken, and some of the game's currency will be granted to the player. In the event of speedrunning though, this curious little container has more of an interesting use. After activating one of the stationary turrets, TGH moves down the stairs to line up a grab in a specific way. In the middle of pulling himself to the turret, he uses the effigy at a specific point to interrupt the pull. This results in TGH falling to the path below, saving a bunch of time over going through the dark tomb and taking the long way around. Going into the West Garden, TGH uses the Holy Cross to grab the sword from the sealed room and moves through the area to get some more important items. One of the gators that chases him through the water gets a pleasant surprise when TGH hits him with the magic orb at a specific spot. When grappling an enemy with the orb and pulling it towards you, if there's no floor below the enemy, they'll just fall until they hit a lower level or one of the game's many kill planes in the unplayable area. While we're on the topic of the orb, it's important to note that while using the orb on set anchors doesn't deplete the magic meter, using it on enemies does, so runners need to keep this in mind for magic management during the run. Getting back on track, letting the gator fall to his untimely death lets TGH get through the area safely, and he can use the Holy Cross to obtain an item called an Ice Bomb. This is important because there's a chest on one of the upper pathways that's out of reach from directly below, but with abusing some mechanics, that'll instantly change. When enemies are turned to ice, not only are they frozen in place and are unable to act, but the way they're interacted with changes as well. Combine this with the magic orb, and you get a very interesting outcome. Using the Ice Bomb, TGH can freeze the enemy above him and simply grapple to the top, saving a substantial amount of time. He then grabs the 4 bombs in the chest, a very important acquisition needed for the next couple of sections, and heads for the cave at the far end of the garden. In this cave lies the second part of the run's puzzle, the magic dagger. This lovely little weapon lets the player turn enemies into ice via a slow stabbing motion. While this doesn't seem effective by itself, we have a couple more stops to make before all the pieces come together. Before grabbing the magic dagger, TGH threw a well-timed bomb to take another death and warp back to the shrine in the ruined atoll. After a quick run through the overworld, TGH ends up at the dark tomb that was skipped earlier. While running through these couple of rooms, I want to point out the damage he's taking here. It's not the first time this has happened, with him taking some during the West Garden section, but this damage is intentional and it serves a couple of purposes. First of all, it ensures that the bombs will cause death when ran into, allowing for easy death warp setups when required. Second of all, it's used for the card buff that's collected here called the orange Peril ring. When at critical health, the buff increases the player's attack considerably. This is one of the things that makes TUNIC speedrunning at the top level so exciting. It requires playing on the absolute razor's edge. The skill required to make it through these upcoming sections, let alone finish a run, shows how much focus and practice that's needed from not just TGH, but any runner wanting to take on TUNIC's any % category. After getting the orange Peril ring, We see the first instance of using the quit to title screen function to warp back to the beginning of some of the dungeons and rooms. This particular one sends TGH back to the beginning of the Dark Tomb and sets him up for getting the last piece of what's needed to break the game. TGH climbs up these ladders and grapples his way up to the Fire Rod, the last major equipment he gets in the game. After 6.5 minutes of his run, he can finally make his way towards the first boss. The path to the next area is immediately blocked by an impassable steel gate, but TGH finds a way around this with one of the game's special equipment combos. If you use the magic dagger and the fire rod on the same frame, the fire shot turns into an ice shot that freezes an enemy. It not only has much more range than the magic dagger by itself, but it also uses much less magic, allowing it to be fired multiple times. TGH uses this in combination with the magic orb to pull an enemy through the gate, freeze it, and pulls himself to the below point where the enemy is at. Doing this gives TGH a one-way ticket to the quarry, which is normally a late game area. After using the prayer mechanics and activating the pillars to open the door at the bottom of the quarry, we get to see the magic orb and ice shot in action once again. Normally, getting to the bottom of the quarry requires taking on the scavenger enemies and slowly working through the convoluted section. To make this easier and much faster, he goes right past the shrine located near the wooden bridge to a specific spot, grabs a scavenger and freezes it during its fall to the bottom, and re-grapples the frozen enemy to fall right into the miasma. While it's not encountered a lot in the run, the miasma is nothing to mess with, draining the player's max and current health to a minimum point. Luckily, after entering the building, the quit to title and reload mechanic can put the player's health back to normal. After a minute-long section that feels like an eternity, it's finally time to enter one of the coolest areas of the game. The ziggurat is filled with many dangerous enemies that can quickly end a run, but the main danger comes in the form of a mini-boss fight with a robot called the Administrator. This is where the 3 bombs that were left over come into play. If timed right, the 3 bombs will hit and stagger the boss, and with 3 sword swings, the first phase of the fight can be finished rather quickly. As for the second phase, a simple stunlock combo with the ice shot and buff sword attack does the trick. For the next part, there are a couple things we need to take a look at. After getting to the bottom of the tower, TGH grabs the lure. This is basically a decoy that draws enemy attacks, which will be useful for later on. If we look at the opposite side of the room, there's a hole at the bottom that leads deeper into the facility. Normally, going through this area requires taking a ladder and an elevator down a few rooms, basically making it an auto-scroller. Throughout speedrunning history, the bane of any great speed game is an unskippable section or cutscene that slows it down. Unless it's Star Fox 64 and then you just deal with the entire game being an auto-scroller. So with any game that has this mechanic, the only way to handle it in a speedrun is to just skip it. TGH uses a couple of return to title resets to align the camera outside the lure room. This allows for a setup that aligns the main character with a specific corner at the edge of the walkway. If you get into position and swing your sword, instead of using normal movement, the character can reach a precise point where he simply falls off the platform. This transitions the player to the room located directly below, dropping right next to the shrine at the beginning of the lower ziggurat area. This area is fairly simple. TGH grabs the chest of 5 regular bombs and a chest of 3 blueberries. He then dodges the enemies coming after him and fights the 2 administrators at the end of the area. Fortunately for him, the only thing needed to progress out of the area is the activation of the pillar in the middle of the tiny arena. So TGH freezes both administrators and goes on his merry way to the hidden vault, confronting the first true boss fight of the run. The boss scavenger has a ton of dangerous weapons at her arsenal, including several area of effect and long-range attacks that make this fight particularly difficult. Well, at least in the normal sense. Instead of running up to the boss, you can use a fire rod shot to hit the boss scavenger from afar and start the fight early. The bridge will close regardless if you're in the arena or not, so this means that the boss can't hit you with any attacks if positioned correctly. This is only part of the fight though, because runners have the most broken pieces of equipment in the game at this point in the run. At first glance, the boss scavenger looks to be immune to the grappling effect of the orb, but there is a short window where it can actually be used. If you freeze the boss and let it break free, there's a small window where its shield isn't up, and the boss can be pulled with the magic orb. If in the right position, the boss can be pulled to the walkway that moved down at the start of the battle. This doesn't seem like anything too special, but another mechanic comes into play once again. The game's kill zones are everywhere outside of reach, and there was one where the boss scavenger fell down to. There's some randomness as to how fast this boss dies, but overall this saves a ton of time over doing the fight normally. Now that the first key is out of the way, the challenge of toppling the next two bosses for theirs comes much quicker than before. Using another bomb, TGH death warps out of the hidden vault and back to the shrine at the ruined atoll. This death warp saves time over having to activate a pillar and using the teleporter to exit the hidden vault. Quick side note here, I just want to say that it's really interesting how almost the entire run uses a single shrine for warping, and it goes to show that any unintended death can end a run in an instant. This route requires everything to go well, with any deviance punishing the runner with a reset, and a quote from TGH conveys this concept pretty accurately. It's actually kind of scary how quickly the route for this game became as volatile as it is. Right now, it's a game where a huge amount of the challenge in the run is just managing to finish it. Pretty quickly, I was at a point where I knew that if I finished a run, it'd be near the top, but that actually took a while. In many attempts, this makes for a frustrating experience, with even the smallest mistakes sending a run to the Shadow Realm. However, when it all comes together, it creates something magical. Back to the ruined atoll, there are 4 pillars that the player needs to interact with in order to progress. These pillars are located at each of the map's corners, so reaching each one would be slow, right? In TUNIC Speedrunning, the only barrier to the player's speed, besides a general movement speed cap and some slight RNG, is the player themselves. From executing the frame-perfect ice shots, to timing stun locks on all sorts of enemies. How well the run would go would be mostly up to the skill of the runner, and while I could sing the praises of TGH in his performance of what's about to happen next, it wouldn't mean anything without the support of the community behind the game. Without the hours of diving into the game's route and systematically picking apart every possible scenario, no top runner would be where they're at today. So keep that in mind while we watch TGH soar through this beautiful island. With all the pillars activated, he does another return to title and teleports to the floating library in the sky. While stunning to look at, this beautiful work of art hides a terrible foe. One so terrible that TGH needs to think outside the box to defeat this enemy quickly. The fight with the librarian is one that requires focus and perseverance. Being one of the most difficult in the game, flying out of range for physical attacks, summoning enemies to assist him in battle, and sending unrelenting shockwaves at the player make for a massive challenge. So let's see how exactly TGH takes on this fight. Let's break down what's going on here, because I sure as hell don't remember the fight going this way. I specifically remember dying a lot more than TGH did. After starting a boss fight in TUNIC, usually the path you use to enter gets sealed off and you no longer have access to leave the area. However, there's a small area where you don't get the librarian's attention after climbing to the top. This is where our handy lure comes in that we picked up earlier. So the player can use the lure, climb back down the ladder, and send the lure to activate the boss fight. But this is only half of the trick. After a specific point of the boss fight being triggered, our friendly kill plane becomes active below the battlefield. Luckily for us, the kill plane doesn't extend all the way down, so if the runner can go down the ladder fast enough, the kill plane can be avoided. While all this is happening, the librarian gets ready to perform an attack that brings him very low around the arena, and like the boss scavenger who was defeated so easily, the librarian suffers the same fate when reaching the kill plane. While this looks easy enough, the window to make this work is fairly narrow, and the execution required with the lure is easier said than done. There's even an issue where the trick is only consistent when playing with a frame rate of 60 or 120 Hz. If playing outside of that range, and even sometimes within it, the lure can very easily fall off the arena, causing the quick kill to simply not work. While the community doesn't know exactly what causes this issue, a continuous effort is being made to understand the ins and outs of this trick. Back to the top of the library, TGH grabs the green key and uses another explosive to death warp back to the ruined atoll. Instead of going straight back to the overworld by walking, TGH opts to use the teleporter near the shrine and warp back to the middle of the overworld. He takes the time to rest at the shrine outside the temple and begins his trek to the eastern vault. After getting beat up outside the vault, TGH makes his way through the entrance and into the main floor. Normally, this door is sealed and requires some work to activate the 2 pillars required to unlock it. However, with our trusty fire and ice rod, doors in this game become suggestions, and reality itself bends to the player's will. By blasting an enemy with a couple of fire rod shots and a single ice rod shot, the enemy gets pushed back, and TGH uses the magic orb to reach the edge of the door. When he makes contact with the enemy, an interesting thing happens. When the 2 characters occupy the same space, the playable character's model takes precedence over the enemy's position. This means that the enemy is pushed out of the way, even through some collision. In this case, the frozen enemy is pushed past the door, so TGH can simply use the magic orb once more to pull himself through the wall. He made this look easy, but it can be very easy to fail this trick if one is not careful. With this trick, TGH enters the Eastern Vault's interior in less than 30 seconds of entering the dungeon. From there, we run into the last of the 3 Guardians of the Keys. This gargantuan of a beast is normally a major wake-up call to how difficult the game really is to those looking for their first key. But thanks to the power of the orange Peril ring and stun locking, this boss is reduced to a minor speed bump in the run as a whole. So let's see how fast he takes this thing down.
Oh my god, that Whooper animated emo. I love that. No, I appreciate you checking me out in the recommended though. This palace gets loud.
As quickly as the fight starts, TGH defeats this robot master in a matter of seconds. After unlocking the container the red key is held in and doing a return to title reset to skip a cutscene, he grabs the red key and does another death warp to bring himself back to the overworld. With all 3 keys in hand, the goal here is clear. All he needs to do is enter the sealed temple and finish the game. In a normal playthrough, accessing the temple requires the ringing of 2 bells, one to the east and one to the west. No, you don't have to go through Blighttown for any of these, but they do take some time to reach. However, since doors don't truly exist, we can kite an enemy to the temple door and do some magic to pull ourselves through. The magic isn't done yet, because the keys still need to be placed in the temple, and TGH has just the thing to make this go fast. On each key placement, if timed correctly, he can return to the title in order to skip a cutscene and move on to the next key. He gets this first try for the first 2, and the last one requires a death warp since it's the fastest way to get back outside. The reset tricks require precise timing of returning to the title and then interacting with the key slot within about 2 frames of the menu confirmation, making this one of the hardest tricks in the game. With the keys in their slots and the way to the air open, TGH makes his way to the teleporter for one last confrontation in the far shore. When going to the final arena to fight the air, the player needs to interact with the boss to start the cutscene for the battle. This can be skipped with another well-timed return to title reset and button press within 2 frames to activate the cutscene. This allows for one final skip, saving a substantial amount of time over not performing it. The final battle with the air is a tense one, with the stunlock method being the only way to take this enemy down quickly. The only problem is even with this method, TGH doesn't have enough magic to keep it up for the entire battle. This is where the blueberries that were grabbed from Lower Ziggurat come into play. These blueberries restore the player's magic, but accessing them during the fight is another problem that TGH has to overcome. If you played any Souls games, you'll know that pausing really isn't an option in this genre. The world around you still moves while in the menus, leaving you prone to danger. In Tunic, pausing does put a stop to everything, but going into the item and equipment menu does not. This means that TGH has a limited time to equip the berry, use it outside of the menu, go back into the menu, and equip the sword, all before the air breaks free from being frozen. These windows are extremely tight, and one small input error can mean a dead run. Not only does he have to do this once, but it has to be done a total of 3 times in the fight. He also needs to do it in a way where the boss doesn't break free of the frozen state. This is attained by striking the foe twice, and then freezing the boss again, resetting the amount of time the air is frozen. TGH manages to not only use the blueberries in an absurdly fast manner, but also manages to use the ice shot combo to keep the air stunned for the entire fight. In case you forgot, the shot requires a frame perfect double press of both the knife and rod, so even if the player is careful, frame perfect does tend to introduce some rough mechanics to deal with. With the final blow to the air, TGH closes the run out with a 20:59.7. just barely breaking the next minute barrier that didn't appear to be in reach just a week or so before the run was performed. As of the writing of the script, this is the fastest time on the 90% leaderboard, but several other runners are not too far behind in their progress. The game is still extremely early in its lifespan, with it only being 2 months old as of a few days after this writing. This means that while the run seems to be extremely fast, another major discovery to drive the game's times down even further could be on the horizon. While this title had the unfortunate timing of releasing alongside one of the greatest Soulsborne games to hit the market to date, this adventure stands up so well among the giants that it contends with. While it may not have absurd glitches or a massive following, the TUNIC Speedrun leaves me at the edge of my seat every time I lay eyes on someone performing an attempt. It's a roller coaster of emotion that demands sheer perfection from the player, and sometimes that isn't even enough to conquer this beast of a run. It's not just the runs though that draw me in, but the willingness of the community to collaborate on not only optimizing the game, but also helping veteran speedrunners and newcomers alike take on the massive challenge that this adventure presents. So now that we're at the end, let me present a follow-up to the question I asked at the beginning of our journey. If I asked you now what your favorite speedrun of 2022 was, what would be your reply? Stay hydrated, folks, and thanks for watching.